Filipina girls Hebron and Ristina. Professor John's research project around 2010 to 2020. Hebron and Ristina 2nd/August 3, 2014. As mentioned earlier, Professor John's original research had been rooted in the many women of the Thai nocturnal economy, especially along Sukhumvit Road in Bangkok, that long illuminated artery where commerce and desire flow together like twin rivers in a single delta. There, thousands of women, some Thai, some from Africa, Russia, Laos, and beyond, participated in what journalists often flatten into a single moral category. Victims or agents of their own destiny? Melanie and Nicole. Many of these women were no doubt framed as victims, yet the media lens often behaves like a cheap camera lens in monsoon rain. It blurs more than it reveals. In practice, reality was more baroque, less tragedy, more ledger of agency, adaptation, and calculation. History is not shy about such ambiguities. Many courtesans of earlier centuries would hardly fit neatly into the category of victim, just as Nicole Smith, who married an elderly American capitalist, is rarely discussed in purely one-dimensional terms. Nor is Melanie Trump, who married Donald Trump, some 25 years her senior, easily contained within moral simplifications, especially when certain commentators, to public controversy, describe her trajectory in terms closer to inheritance than exploitation, as an expectant widow. The outrage that followed said as much about modern sensitivities as it did about the comment itself. It is the old fable of the spider and the fly, or what might more archaically be called the Black Widow's parable. The fly, believing himself the hunter, becomes the supper. Returning to Professor John's field notes, he gradually discovered that the so-called victims of the night along Sukhumvit, and in similar districts elsewhere, were often not simply passive figures, but sometimes manggagawaing sariling kapalaran, workers of their own fate, using charm, wit, and sexuality as instruments of social ascent. One might say, in a less clinical idiom, that Cupid and economics were frequently found sharing the same umbrella. In Manila, this complexity became even more visible. John began to observe that in the Philippines, particularly in Makati, Manila, there existed a spectrum of interactions between Western men and Filipina women that could not always be neatly labeled as prostitution without doing violence to nuance itself. Cafes around Greenbelt, especially those near his residence at the New World Hotel, functioned like modern versions of Defoe's moral marketplaces, places where transaction, affection, performance, and ambition blurred into a single conversational cocktail. Digression, swimming. As noted, John was staying at the New World Hotel in Makati, where the 25-meter pool became his private sanctuary. He often swam alone, enjoying the rare silence of water in a city that rarely sleeps. In Norway, pools were plentiful but crowded at inconvenient hours. In Manila, solitude was easier to find if one chose carefully. John had developed what he half-jokingly called his aquatic yoga stroke, a backward swimming style, floating on his back while performing a hybrid of butterfly arms and crawl-like leg motions. Short fins gave him surprising speed, allowing him to outpace swimmers decades younger. Not that competition interested him, the method was more designed to ease the stiffness of an aging body rather than to conquer lanes. The flaw, of course, was obvious. Swimming backwards meant not seeing where one was going. Collisions were a theoretical hazard, which is why an almost empty pool was preferable. In Oslo Fjord, John often swam for hours on end, covering 2 kilometers or more. He preferred the cold freedom of salt water, though jellyfish occasionally reminded him that nature is never entirely decorative, but he wore a wetsuit. The so-called threat of Freya the Walrus, in 2022 added a different chapter. A gentle giant declared inconveniently sociable, and therefore removed by authorities who found excessive friendliness to be a public order issue. One might call it an ironic footnote in human-animal diplomacy. Return to Makati. That evening, boredom guided John into a wandering stroll around Makati. In Greenbelt he encountered several freelancers, a term that, like many euphemisms, carries more vagueness than precision. Some were clearly working the night economy, others may simply have been women enjoying conversation and music. At Café Havana, its Hemingway theme quietly ironic given speculation about Hemingway's wartime injuries and impotence, he met two women, Hebron and Ristina, along with a third whose name dissolved later in memory like ice in warm rum. A short, bar-hopping expedition followed toward Burgos Street, 15 minutes by taxi but psychologically closer to another continent. Drinks were shared, laughter exchanged, and money, like time, quietly dissolved into the night's fabric. At some point, the unnamed companion exited the narrative after a heated taxi disagreement between the three women that nearly became a minor fracas. Hebron and Ristina remained victorious after having terminated the opposition. John, mildly intoxicated and operating in what he later described as fieldwork mode with blurred optics, attempted photographic documentation for his research archive. The results, predictably, resembled impressionist paintings after rainfall. Two girls. What followed was not unfamiliar within John's observations. In certain sexual social configurations, intimacy arranged itself like improvised theater. One woman becomes principal performer, the other an auxiliary presence, supporting, observing, sometimes participating in ways that defy simple categorization. Anthropologically speaking, John noted that many research participants appeared aware of male fantasy structures in advance, including the familiar male Western expectation of female erotic interplay. Whether authentic or performed mattered less than its functionality within the sexual script. In this instance, Ristina became the central figure, while Hebron shifted into a supporting role, an arrangement they appeared to navigate with practiced ease. Back at the hotel, verbal play emerged as its own performance layer. Taglish, inflected English, half improvised, half theatrical, filled the room. "Oh yes, darling, push me harder, bury that love in you deep," Ristina murmured, her speech oscillating between sincerity and role play. John, for his part, sometimes found himself more observer than participant in his own fieldwork, though observation and participation were, in this research, permanently entangled. Hebron assisted in ways that suggested familiarity with the choreography of such evenings, such as by massaging Ristina's nipples and John's family jewels, while laughter, breath, and fragmented English phrases created a kind of private multilingual naughty comic opera. At one point Ristina moaned, half in jest, half in abandon, "Ease, baby, milk my poor titties, and suck hard so you can taste my sweet baby juice." The night extended into the familiar dissolution of boundaries, time, language, and intent, until dawn arrived like a quiet accountant, tallying nothing and forgiving everything. Research funds. The following morning, memory proved less reliable than sleep. John could not later reconstruct exact financial details, only that modest sums changed hands, perhaps around 5,000 pesos each. Receipts were not part of the methodology. Email addresses were exchanged, as modern anthropology increasingly requires a digital afterlife. Café Havana commentary. Café Havana, with its curated Cuban nostalgia and Hemingway aesthetic, remains a study in layered irony. One is reminded that Hemingway, whether or not sexually diminished by war injuries, as some anecdotes suggest, continues to preside over spaces he never visited in this configuration. Why Western men gather in such places is not, as John noted, particularly mysterious. Makati functions as a financial node populated by expatriates, where wage differentials operate like invisible gravity. A simple arithmetic emerges: if local wages approximate $25 a day while visiting professionals may earn $250 or more, a tenfold asymmetry is established. Under conditions of social freedom and urban nightlife infrastructure, relationships involving money, companionship, and affection become statistically more probable. Hebron and Ristina, Project Image. Young women, their children and families. Professor John was increasingly confused by his own research. He was often 2, and sometimes nearly 3, times the age of his research participants. Yet many of these young women seemed determined that the relationship should progress beyond research and into practical family affairs. Some suggested that he help support their children, others hinted that he might even father one himself. Several offered him what appeared to be eternal love, devotion, and occasionally a detailed budget. John would explain that his research funds were limited. They could stretch to a few dinners, occasional emergencies, and perhaps the odd educational expense, but not to supporting an entire bloodline for the next 20 years. "My grant only lasts 5 years, he would protest. This argument rarely carried much weight. Of course, fathering children in old age is hardly unprecedented. One need only glance at the sultans of the Ottoman Empire, various aging film stars, rock musicians, and celebrities. Al Pacino became a father in his 70s, and several members of the Rolling Stones demonstrated a similar commitment to biological optimism. The difficulty, John reflected, was arithmetic. A man might become a father at 75, but by the time the child graduated from university, he might be approaching 100. Time, unlike politicians and academics, cannot be persuaded to extend its deadlines. Ironically, many of the young Filipinos John met regarded such arrangements as perfectly normal. In their eyes, age was merely another variable in the equation of life, like height, income, or whether one snored. John himself was not always entirely truthful on the subject. When asked his age by young women in Asia, he often performed a minor act of mathematical surgery, discreetly removing 20 years from the patient. The truth was that he remained surprisingly fit. Many Filipino men of his age had long since departed this world and were busy nourishing worms and root vegetables from below. John, however, remained stubbornly active. His aging vessel creaked in places, but certain departments of the enterprise continued to operate with remarkable enthusiasm. Indeed, his principal instrument of anthropological curiosity still regarded retirement as an unfortunate fascist conspiracy. Consequently, it was not unusual for Filipino women to discuss the possibility of children, marriage, or some form of long-term arrangement involving regular monthly remittances. Manny the taxi driver. John remembered a taxi driver named Manny telling him one such story. NB, Manila taxi drivers are often superior to newspapers as sources of information. They may occasionally invent half of what they tell you, but newspapers often charge money for doing the same thing. Manny explained that a wealthy elderly American he knew of was supporting an extended family consisting of perhaps 30 or 50 relatives. The exact number varied depending on how many San Miguel beers Manny had consumed before telling the story. The arrangement was simple. The American provided financial assistance. In return, he enjoyed the companionship and feminine attentions of one of the family's youngest and most beautiful members. John had encountered similar situations himself. In some poor communities, beauty could become an economic resource. Families occasionally encouraged their most attractive daughter to seek opportunities abroad or in major cities. He recalled meeting a striking young African woman in Bangkok who was earning money in the nightlife industry. "Why are you doing this?" John asked. She shrugged. "I am the most beautiful of my sisters," she replied. "My family decided I should come to Bangkok, comfort lonely men, and send money home." The answer was delivered so matter-of-factly that it sounded less like a confession than a job description. In this context, beauty could become a burden as much as a blessing. One is reminded of Justine in the Marquis de Sada's novel, whose virtues and young beauty repeatedly became the source of her troubles. Youth and attractiveness may open doors, but sometimes they open doors leading into complicated corridors. Falling into the digital support trap. As mentioned previously, in the early 2000s, John had supported numerous women throughout Asia, partly through research funds and partly through his own pocket. To his surprise, the occasional act of generosity had a habit of reproducing itself. One contribution became two. Two became five. Before long, a modest monthly transfer acquired cousins, aunties, school fees, medical expenses, and occasionally a family dog. In other words, John had, to some extent, fallen into what he privately called the digital support trap, supported by organizations such as PayPal and others. The trap was simple. Modern technology allowed affection, obligation, guilt, friendship, romance, and financial assistance to travel instantly across continents. The difficulty was that the bills traveled equally fast. John was not a wealthy man. Whatever his faults, he lacked the bank account of an oil sheik, a tech billionaire, or a successful televangelist. Therefore, every support arrangement came with a practical expiry date. As for fatherhood, he doubted it was particularly likely at his advanced age, though examples such as Al Pacino suggested it remained theoretically possible. Nature, after all, occasionally enjoys practical jokes. Single mothers. There are millions of single mothers throughout the world seeking stability for themselves and their children. In poorer regions, the challenge can be especially acute. John occasionally wondered whether he was exploiting such situations or helping to alleviate them. The answer depended largely on one's perspective. To some observers he appeared cynical, to others he resembled a benefactor. Like many matters involving money, affection, and human relationships, the truth was probably untidily located somewhere in the middle. What was beyond dispute was that many women welcomed the presence of a stable partner capable of providing support. Whether that partner was 30, 50, or 70 often mattered less than outsiders imagined. Indeed, some women seemed entirely untroubled by the fact that John could, theoretically, have been their grandfather. Yet John himself remained uncertain. He was not a man who embraced responsibility on a whim. Fatherhood was one thing. Many men accepted enormous burdens for the sake of their children. But John was now in his 70s. At that stage of life, he reflected, one was not merely searching for romance, companionship, or youthful beauty. One was searching for someone with whom one could share breakfast, argue about politics, complain about the weather, and discuss the absurdities of the world over coffee and pandesal. In the end, that simple conversation across the breakfast table often seemed more valuable than all the promises of eternal devotion made under tropical moonlight. Chapter 4 Kathy. John's first Filipina love. Introduction. What perhaps should have been made clearer in the introduction is that Professor John's research into the exploited women of the East covered a remarkably broad spectrum of humanity. It ranged from girlfriends and pen pals to casual acquaintances, nightclub hostesses, and women whom Western bureaucrats, journalists, and moral crusaders would quickly classify as prostitutes. Their first meeting had been entirely innocent. John, wishing to demonstrate goodwill and perhaps also to impress Kathy, gave her 20,000 pesos. For him, it was a modest research expense. For Kathy, who had recently lost her job after an unpleasant incident involving her employer's cousin who tried to rape her, it represented several months of income. As mentioned elsewhere in this narrative, labels such as a prostitute often reveal more about the person applying the label than about the woman receiving it. Entire libraries of sociological speculation, stretching from Max Weber to Michel Foucault, have been devoted to such matters. Fortunately for the reader, we shall spare ourselves a lengthy theoretical detour. Instead, let us return to Kathy. I do not possess the lyrical gifts of Vladimir Nabokov or John Donne when describing young feminine beauty. Nevertheless, every chronicler must make an attempt. Young girls, better than Viagra. The youthful Kathy did more for John's erotic vitality than any pharmaceutical product known to modern science. Her slight bamboo-like figure, shy smile, and almost old-fashioned innocence acted upon him like a tonic distilled by mischievous evil demons. One might say that where chemistry failed, youth succeeded. Yet each man kills the thing he loves, wrote Oscar Wilde. John often thought of that line years later. He had a peculiar talent for misplacing diamonds. Not literal diamonds, of course, his finances would never have permitted such extravagance, but human diamonds. Again and again, he allowed promising relationships to drift away, only to spend years looking back over his shoulder like a traveler who realizes too late that he has left his luggage at the station. In moments of melodrama he compared himself to William Shakespeare's tragic heroes. His fatal flaw? Not ambition. Not jealousy. Not revenge. Simply an inability to recognize happiness while it stood directly in front of him. Return to Kathy. Perhaps Kathy saw him as a kind of rescuer. Perhaps she imagined he could solve all the practical difficulties that crowded around her young life. John, meanwhile, felt both attracted and guilty. He liked her enormously, yet he had known her only briefly. The relationship occupied that strange territory between romance and possibility. Kathy possessed a certain Lolita-like quality, though perhaps closer to the popular myth than to the actual heroine created by Nabokov. At 22, she appeared considerably younger, and could have passed for a 13-year-old schoolgirl with her tangerine-like boobies, small frame, and stick-like limbs. In other words, John could enjoy forbidden fruit without breaking the laws of men or the law of God. Unlike many women John encountered later, she seemed refreshingly free from relentless financial calculations. John was staying at the Pan Pacific Manila in May late, and Kathy knew perfectly well that it was a luxury hotel. Naturally, this encouraged certain hopes. She imagined sophistication. She imagined security. She imagined the future. John, meanwhile, imagined far less practical things. As often happens, neither side fully understood the other. Robinson's Place. After many messages, they finally arranged to meet at Robinson's Place. Ermita, Manila. Their rendezvous point was a Starbucks near the entrance. Following the usual confusion that accompanies meetings arranged by mobile phone, they eventually found each other. John, despite his years, remained athletic, and fond of dressing like a retired colonial explorer. His khaki shorts and neatly pressed shirt ensured he stood out among the crowd. David Livingstone, John's relation. In an aside, Professor John was actually related to one such colonial explorer called David Livingstone of Africa and Hollywood fame. David Livingstone was a Scottish missionary, physician, anti-slavery campaigner, and explorer who traveled extensively through southern and central Africa during the 19th century and is often associated with the era of European colonial expansion, although he saw himself primarily as a missionary and humanitarian rather than a colonial administrator, while the famous greeting, "Dr. Livingstone, I presume," was reportedly spoken by the Welsh-American journalist and explorer Henry Morton Stanley when he finally located Livingstone near Ujiji in 1871 after a long search funded by the New York Herald, and the phrase subsequently became one of the most famous quotations in exploration history, gaining further popular recognition through books, documentaries, and films, including the Hollywood movie, Stanley and Livingstone, which helped cement the encounter in popular culture. Exploring hidden chasms. However, although Professor John was interested in exploration like his uncle, he took the micro rather than the macro perspective, and was not so much interested in traveling up the rivers of the African continent, but instead traveling inside the chasms of his colonial research participants in order to discover some hidden secrets. This observation reminded John of an uncomfortable fact. It was unlikely that young women were drawn exclusively by his irresistible charm. Luxury hotels, attentive service, air conditioning, and the temporary escape from poverty possess attractions of their own. Such realities did not necessarily invalidate affection. Human relationships are rarely so simple. Kathy's roles. Kathy alternated between different roles: innocent girl, playful flirt, daughter figure, companion, and aspiring future wife. John likewise shifted between mentor, protector, admirer, and occasionally love-struck fool. In the Philippines, Kathy might have been regarded as an ordinary young woman from a modest background. John treated her like royalty. For him, she became a source of energy and optimism, a small fountain bubbling unexpectedly in the middle of an otherwise dry landscape. The passport. When it came time for Kathy to leave, John decided to help her financially. He expected a major request. Experience had taught him to fear conversations that began with, "John, I want to ask you something." His imagination immediately produced visions of weddings, visas, medical emergencies, family debts, and entire villages requiring sponsorship. "John, I hope you won't get angry," she said. John prepared himself for catastrophe. Instead, Kathy asked for only 2,000 pesos. She needed a passport. That was all. John nearly laughed with relief. For a brief moment, the dragons lurking in his imagination turned out to be nothing more threatening than a young woman hoping to obtain a travel document. And thus ended one of the least expensive crises of Professor John's entire research career. Conclusion. This concludes Volume 1 of Professor John's research in the Philippines. John has written many other drafts to continue his research, but the university funding might not financially cover these further investigations, so he may be dependent on private donations, but as they say in popular media, watch this space. Future research. But to encourage private donations, John will include here a research photo portfolio of possible future research participants who mainly remain unnamed for the time being due to research ethics. In line with the guidelines of the university's Research Ethical Committee, all the participants are aged 18 or over, although some Filipina girls tend to look like girls in their early teens, due to their small stature.